to learn. It takes time to realize the necessary virtues of empathy and patience if the world of the other is to be properly understood. So once I got to this point, I realized that what I thought of as a rather leisurely trilogy of books was going to become a rather more busy quartet. So, a fourth volume. I've got a title, an immediate starting point, and a few notes, which I'm going to share with you, plus a single dominating claim, which is not altogether surprising, but I'll give it to you. A Christian contribution to the encounter of religions has to be focused around the paschal mystery of the death and resurrection of Christ. This isn't because it's important in the midst of religious plurality to keep a sense of what makes for Christian distinctness, though that is clearly a sine qua non for any sort of orthodoxy. More profoundly, in a fraught and contested world of many cultures and convictions, it offers both theoretical and practical clarification of those fundamental questions about the depth and meaning of things that challenge and disturb the movements of the human spirit. There is, of course, a massive, ever-proliferating literature that takes its rise from Jesus' own response to that Christological question. Who do you say that I am? And much of that literature will, no doubt, appear in the course of this new book. Similarly, there is a growing literature of what is sometimes called genitive theology, theology of this or of that. What does theology have to say about social justice, about peacemaking, religious pluralism, education, feminism, politics, or of course, plague and pandemic? The list is endless. The task, however, is not to apply pre-existing theological insights to an area of general concern, but the other way round, to examine what is already theological about specific experiences of human living. The subtitle of my Waiting on Grace book is a case in point. I call it A Theology of Dialogue. It's about the foundational nature of a religious sensibility formed by the biblical experience of being called, being invited to encounter holy mystery, of being in dialogue. So much by way of introduction. Let me offer you 3 sets of notes and then ask you to help me, please, to knit them together. The first is a particular experience of Christ in multi-religious context. It's an event I helped organize just 20 years ago for the beginning of the millennium, in which Jesus was to be celebrated as a source not of division, but of unity and understanding. The second note is Christological. My point here is that a Christology which would be faithful to the originating story of the Church's own experience of God with us, yet does not totalize others into a Christianity-centered scheme of things, means letting Christ be in some sense other, beyond what we can ever expect to comprehend. The third note, all too briefly, considers the implications of a Christology in which the Word is incarnated in the world of human relations for the Church's. What are the implications of the incarnation of Christ in the world, the Word in the world, for the Church's life in community, or its civic interaction? If we were not meeting remotely, I would pass around a copy of the commemorative volume which we produced 20 years ago for that millennium celebration. I've got one copy here, which you can see. Celebrating Jesus, a cross-religious event that included all sorts of interesting things: processions, symbolic acts of placing objects, lighting candles, readings, silent meditation. The readings which are collected in the book vary enormously, yet they carry a significant resonance across the traditions. Jesus was a Jew. And even apart from the Jewish prophecies that Christians read as being fulfilled in the mystery of Christ, there is a growing number of reflections on his significance within a Jewish perspective. In Islam, of course, Jesus plays a more significant role as a prophet of Islam. Buddhism and Hinduism have their advocates of Jesus as a holy man, an avatar, a bodhisattva. Thich Nhat Hanh, the extraordinary Vietnamese Zen teacher of interbeing, has written warmly about Jesus, as has the Dalai Lama. Sri Ramakrishna, to mention just one important Hindu name, he had a particular devotion to Jesus as his guru. And the temples that follow his tradition always have a picture of Jesus alongside other religious teachers and founders. My particular favorite is a book of poetry from a Sikh statesman, Gopal Singh, called, interestingly, The Man Who Never Died, and intended to catch something of the universal truth that is Christ. These are a few of his words that we read out that evening. This is the story of the man who never died, and who proclaimed that he who is born must be reborn, and he who is dead must rise from the state of death. For it is not in the nature of man to die, but to live from no time to no time. When asked how the world was born, he said, out of the word. For even when the world was not, the word was. Men asked him, how shall we pray? He answered, does the seed ask, how shall I pray? It enters into its closet, shuts its door, prays in secret as if not praying, and fasts as if not fasting, till it grows into a flower, and prays not with words, but through fragrance. Pray you like the mute earth that revolves ceaselessly round the sun, saying, let your will be done on earth as it is in heaven. The end of that little quotation. Now, there's more here, I think, than a charming play on themes that find their origins in perhaps half-remembered readings of the Christian scriptures. That would be too cynical. Gopal Singh's poem has its own integrity. It's not a theological formula like the Chalcedonian definition. It's not an incipient version of what found their way into the Christian creeds. It's a statement of reverence and respect to sit alongside texts which think of Jesus as holy man, spiritual master, prophet. In the introduction to the collection, I suggested that the readings should be set within a tradition of responses which actually take their rise from Jesus's own Christological question. The story of the Caesarea Philippi confession is, I think we can say, the center of the gospel. It's a turning point. But it's important to remember that Peter only got the answer half right. He did not expect, and he certainly did not want, a Messiah who had come to suffer. At the time, the disciples were mystified. It was only later, in the light of resurrection faith, they came to understand what Jesus was saying. He is the touchstone. Here is the touchstone by which their sense of God is to be reckoned. So right in the middle of the gospel, a dramatic question mark, is raised over all human claims to know God, to know what God is all about. We're given a salutary reminder that it is always difficult to make hard and fast distinctions between an inner elite who have been initiated into the truth, know it all, and the rest of underprivileged humankind who languish in darkness. What Paul rejoiced in as the scandal of the cross is not a claim to some esoteric intuition into the nature of God. Neither is it an invitation to sheer irrationality. It acts as a reminder that at the heart of all faith lies hesitation and a struggle to make sense of the mystery of the ultimate touching into our frail earth. And that takes me to my second note and the implications of Jesus's Christological question in a multi-faith world. Now, I do not want to argue about what it would take to turn these incipient confessions from other religions into something approaching orthodox Christology. The great value of a book like Michael Amelados's The Asian Jesus, published some years ago now, is not that it raises the intriguing question about how Christianity might have developed if the apostles had preached the gospel in the Sanskritic culture of the East, rather than translating its Hebrew idioms into the Greek-speaking culture that already surrounded them. Rather, he explores titles that come from the Indian religious world in order to ask what resonances are heard when the gospel story is read and prayed in another religious culture. And I see our little collection as doing something similar. What would it take to open up a context of generous empathy in which the implications of the Christological question for human living can be heard? We're opening up a dialogue, we're opening up a context in which questions can be raised and generously addressed. What does it take to do that? Religions consist of comprehensive views centered around uniquely significant accounts of primal moments, and they're usually associated with a founder figure or a revelation myth of some kind. In a consciously pluralist, multi-religious context, the danger is that claims to uniqueness are made at the cost of polemical comparisons with other claims. Christ is unique in the obvious sense that the Christian comprehensive view is particular to a certain history. Whatever metaphors are used, the meaning of the early confessions, Jesus as Lord, as Christ, as Son of God, as Word, etc., is that in the person of Jesus, human beings have been touched by God in a way that has a universal significance. This is not to say, however, that there can be no continuity between what has been decisively revealed in Jesus Christ, Orthodox Christian faith, and what it is and what is to be discerned of God in the economy of creation and in the history of God's dealings with human beings as a whole. In other words, the crucial question for any Christology in this pluralist context is not how Christ's uniqueness can be maintained over against other claims to uniqueness, particularity, but how contingent historical events can reveal a truth which is significant for all humankind. How can God's eternal word become flesh, revealed at the very heart of our humanness? To oversimplify what is, of course, a massively complex issue, how to avoid the danger of speaking on the one hand as if the divine nature exists as an independent agent above the action, as it were, out there, and on the other, of human nature as the object of such an instrumentalizing agency, reduced, as it were, by this power from outside. Unsurprisingly, none of our readings grappled with such a question, but some at least implied it. Versions of the theological question of how one can talk about the relationship of God and the world without collapsing the one into the other is there in all religious traditions. Even a non-theistic tradition like Buddhism warns against an uncritical use of language, which can turn the ultimate ineffable into projections of the mind, objects of consciousness. That second note, and it is only that, morphs into a third, what I want to call a political Christology of religions. In the preface of Waiting, I concluded an instant overview of its main ideas with the following observation. Throughout this book, an earlier theme from my first two books is repeated and I hope intensified. The Trinitarian, or more exactly Spirit-centered vision of a God-soaked otherness that points the way to a Christology of Jesus, the faithful, Torah-observant Jew. A Spirit-centered vision of a God-soaked otherness, focused around a Christology of Jesus, the Jew. In a religiously pluralist context, Jesus is himself the embodiment, what I call the returning other, the one never to be suppressed by violence or homogenized into a system. The other, that great theme of postmodern thought which tantalizes with its singular obscurity. Not some static object which stands over against the self. To think in such terms reifies what by definition is other, not to be included willy-nilly within the comprehensible. When that happens all too easily, the other loses its true otherness. Nowadays, of course, the encounter with otherness is taken for granted as a facet of our multicultural society. It's a much more common experience than it was 50 years ago. And yet, the various political crises that have convulsed the world since the millennium, the contentious relationship between Islam and the West, still there, the financial crisis 10 or more years ago, the rise of populism, the never-ending tragedy of migration, now, of course, the pandemic. They all remind us of something else. It's what I like to call the law of otherness. I'd like to think this is original to me, but it isn't. It basically comes from Michel de Certeau. The law of otherness. This states that if otherness is reduced or suppressed, it will only come back in another way. If otherness is reduced or suppressed, it will only come back in another way. The other is not some vaguely defined spiritual reality, which can never be pinned down in well-reasoned categories, but more obscurely, a force that resists the drive to control and homogenize human experience. More positively, its strange depth, a restless presence, you might say, at the very core of who we are, so often interrupts our efforts at control, acting as a locus of revelation and wisdom. So let me conclude. In the penultimate paragraph of Waiting on Grace, when I'd given up trying to deal with this subject in any detail, I put it like this, right at the end. The comprehensive view generated by the mystery of Christ does not seek to impose a Christian set of answers, but to raise for others the same possibility it holds out to the church itself, to be touched and formed by the grace of God after the manner of Jesus' own obedience to the Father. My question then is about how the church can learn to engage critically with the many ways in which an ever-returning, never to be repressed otherness structures our very being. How to frame a political Christology that takes both church and wider society beyond a superficial civic interreligion of tolerance and diversity, and calls all persons of faith to take responsibility for the common good.